Brush my teeth. I've been woke for 45 minutes, man.
Rapper Li Rye went from having millions of dollars to losing it all to drug addiction. Once the money ran out, he made a desperate, unthinkable move that landed him behind bars. Now facing a potential 50-year sentence, recent reports suggest he's having a rough time in custody because of his reputation, and the guards are reportedly refusing to move him into protective custody. I'm going to break down this entire situation for you, so stay tuned because you won't want to miss a single detail. Li Rye's story isn't just your typical rapper gone wrong narrative. This is about a young man from one of America's most dangerous neighborhoods who was handed a golden ticket out, only to toss it away for the very streets that raised him. Born and raised in a gritty environment where survival is a constant battle, Li Rye grew up where poverty rates exceed 40%. In his neighborhood, gunshots are as frequent as car horns, and many young men are either dead or incarcerated before they turn 25. Like so many others, he was just another kid trying to find his way through those treacherous streets. His family was constantly struggling to make ends meet. His mother worked multiple jobs just to pay the bills, while his father spent years cycling in and out of the prison system. Like so many others in that position, Li Rye was pulled toward the quick cash of the streets. To him, the guys on the corner with their expensive cars and jewelry were the only symbols of success in a place where real opportunities were nowhere to be found. However, what set Li Rye apart from everyone else was his raw musical talent. He had a way of storytelling through rap that hit home for anyone living that life. He began by freestyling at local cyphers and playing underground shows, eventually making a name for himself in Atlanta's cutthroat rap scene. His lyrics weren't just for show. They were honest accounts of poverty and the daily battle to survive in an environment that felt rigged against young black men. But in the neighborhood, we all know that talent isn't enough on its own. You need an opening, and those opportunities don't just show up at your door in the projects. You could be the most gifted artist in the city, but without the right connections or a platform to get your voice heard, you're destined to stay fly on the wall. But Li Rye's luck was about to take a turn that would change his life forever. When Gucci Mane heard his music through a mutual contact in the Atlanta scene, he immediately recognized he'd found someone special. But this wasn't just a standard record deal. The details go much deeper than that. Gucci didn't just sign Li Rye for a modest advance like most newcomers get. We're talking about a deal worth $2.5 million, life-altering money for a young man who had never seen more than a couple $1,000s at once. This wasn't just a contract. It was a total overhaul of Li Rye's entire world and the lives of everyone in his circle. The real shocker was how quickly it all happened. Overnight, he went from sharing a cramped one-bedroom apartment with several family members to purchasing a suburban mansion. He was suddenly surrounded by a fleet of luxury cars, jewelry worth more than a typical annual salary, designer clothes, and high-end watches. Most importantly, he gained a level of status and respect in the streets that he had never felt before. For someone who grew up in constant survival mode wearing the same pair of shoes until they literally fell apart in going to bed, hungry more often than not, this sudden influx of wealth was overwhelming. But as the saying goes, money doesn't change you. It just reveals your true self. In Li Rye's case, it became clear that he never had the guidance to handle that kind of success or manage his finances responsibly. However, the story gets much darker than a simple rags to riches tale. Li Rye began pouring his fortune into drugs. He wasn't just using them. He was buying in bulk to supply his entire circle of friends. Massive amounts of money were being wasted on pills, lean, Molly, and other substances that were systematically draining both his bank account and his mental health. What began as occasional use quickly spiraled into a full-blown addiction that took over every part of his life. While drug culture in hip-hop is certainly nothing new, for Li Rye, it was becoming a fatal flaw. But Li Rye took things to an entirely different level. He wasn't just using drugs to handle the pressure of fame. He was using them to numb the trauma of his past and the sheer intensity of his new life. The jump from extreme poverty to massive wealth can be just as jarring as any other life crisis. And without a solid support system, many people turn to substances just to cope. Li Rye fell straight into that trap. Instead of running his music career like a professional business, he treated it like he'd won the lottery. The money was flowing, the parties never stopped, and drugs were always within reach. His entire crew was living large off his success, and Li Rye was too high and too generous to see he was being taken advantage of. People who were nowhere to be found when he was struggling were suddenly always around, everyone with their hand out expecting a payday. This wasn't just partying anymore. It was a serious addiction that started destroying his work ethic. He began missing studio sessions and damaging the professional ties that had landed him his deal in the first place. Engineers complained about him showing up hours late if he showed up at 8. Producers grew frustrated because he simply couldn't focus long enough to record. Music videos were constantly delayed because he was simply too intoxicated to perform. As a businessman who had overcome his own battles with addiction and the law, Gucci Mane saw the writing on the wall. He had invested heavily in Li Rye, not just that initial signing bonus, but also massive amounts for studio time, videos, marketing, and touring. In this industry, when an artist becomes unreliable, it hits everyone's pockets. The news that truly shocked the industry was when Gucci Mane decided to officially drop Li Rye from the label. This wasn't a snap judgment. Gucci had genuine hopes for his success, but he realized Li Rye was on a crash-out path. He didn't want that kind of liability attached to his brand, especially as the return on his investment was disappearing. This is where the real-world consequences of Li Rye's choices set in. After losing his deal, his momentum vanished almost instantly. The music industry is ruthless. Once you're labeled as problematic or a liability, the doors slammed shut. Radio stations stopped his airplay, streaming platforms pulled their support, and other artists stopped answering his calls for collaborations. Li Rye suddenly found himself in a nightmare scenario. He had burned through most of his cash, lost his contract, and was watching his career fall apart. The mansion went into foreclosure, the luxury cars were repossessed, and his jewelry was sold off just to settle debts. Predictably, the friends who were there when the money was flowing disappeared the moment the well ran dry. Instead of fighting to rebuild his career, seeking help for his addiction, or trying to repair his industry connections, Li Rye gave up on music and retreated back to the streets. This is a pattern we see far too often with artists who reach the top but can't handle the weight of the responsibility. The hood starts to feel like a comfortable escape, even though it's the exact place they were trying to get away from in the first place. But here is the dangerous part. Returning to the streets after tasting success is different than never leaving. You become a massive target because people assume you still have money or valuable connections. On top of that, the psychological toll of losing everything often leads to desperation and terrible decision-making. The situation took a turn for the worse because Li Rye was already on the law's radar. He had been picked up on a misdemeanor charge, likely something related to drugs or a minor dispute, and was actually released on bond. For a split second, it looked like he might have caught a break and had a chance to fix his life. But just 2 hours after he tasted freedom, federal agents moved in and picked him up. This wasn't a minor local issue anymore. The feds don't show up unless they have substantial evidence of major crimes. And when they come for you, they usually have an airtight case ready to go.
Back home, last day in, first day out. Brush my teeth. I've been woke for 45 minutes.
Let me break down exactly what happened that landed Li Rye in his current mess, because this is where the story gets truly wild. He was at a recording studio, maybe trying to get his career back on track or just sticking to familiar territory. In those environments, it's not unusual to see large amounts of cash for studio time, equipment, or other business deals. On that particular day, someone at the studio was carrying $100,000 in cash. We don't know the exact reason for it, but in the music world, large cash transactions for things like features happen all the time. Li Rye, who was desperate and likely under the influence, saw a quick fix for his financial ruin. Alongside a friend from his neighborhood who was also struggling, he decided to rob the person. We're talking about armed robbery, a major federal offense that carries heavy time, especially with that much money involved. But the victim showed more heart than most people would and refused to hand over the bag. That's when things escalated from a robbery to something much more dangerous. Li Rye made a split-second decision that changed his life forever. He pulled the trigger. Luckily, he missed. But that shot added attempted murder to a list of charges that already included armed robbery and weapons violations. Realizing how bad they had messed up, Li Rye and his accomplice fled the scene. But the damage was done. In a world full of security cameras and digital footprints, running away doesn't mean you're getting away. Authorities had enough evidence to identify and track down Li Rye within hours of the shooting. Now, let's get into what's actually happening to him behind bars, because this is where the story takes a truly tragic turn. He's currently facing up to 50 years in federal prison for armed robbery, attempted murder, and multiple weapons charges. Given his age, this is effectively a life sentence. Even if he manages to get the minimum, he'll be an old man by the time he sees the outside world again, assuming he even survives the stint. But his legal battles are only the beginning. Li Rye doesn't have the funds to hire a top-tier lawyer, the kind of high-powered attorney who could negotiate a plea deal or find the technicalities needed to reduce his time. Every cent from that massive record deal is gone, wasted on drugs, parties, and luxury cars that were eventually repossessed. Even the people he bankrolled disappeared the second the handcuffs clicked. Now, he's stuck with a public defender who, despite their best efforts, simply doesn't have the time or resources to build the kind of defense that could save him. Public defenders are notoriously overworked and underpaid, often juggling dozens of cases at the same time. They simply can't offer the level of focus or the deep resources a private attorney provides. But the real tragedy is what's happening to him inside the prison walls. because Li Rye is a public figure, or at least well-known. In certain circles, he's become a massive target for other inmates. In prison culture, celebrities are often viewed as soft, privileged, or as having hidden access to cash and resources. This makes them prime targets for extortion, harassment, and violence. According to sources close to the situation, Li Rye is being relentlessly pressed by inmates, who see him as an easy mark. We're hearing about physical altercations where he's been jumped by groups, death threats, and constant intimidation from people demanding money or commissary items he doesn't even have. For someone who was living in total luxury with security just a few years ago, this reality is likely more terrifying than anything he could have imagined. Prison is a completely different world with its own brutal rules and hierarchies. What matters on the outside, fame, money, and status, often means nothing behind bars. In fact, it usually just puts a bigger bullseye on your back. The other inmates view celebrities as people who squandered opportunities they themselves would have died for, often feeling that these stars deserve whatever hardship comes their way. But the situation gets even grimmer. The prison guards are reportedly refusing to place him in protective custody. In the prison system, PC is where inmates at high risk of violence are separated from the general population. It's a tough way to live, essentially staying in solitary confinement for most of the day, but it's a necessary shield when you have a literal target on your back. Li Rye's predicament is made even worse by the specific nature of his crimes. Armed robbery and attempted murder don't exactly earn you respect behind bars. If he had been locked up for high-level drug distribution or organized crime, he might have commanded some level of authority. But robbing someone, especially another person within the music industry, is viewed as a desperate, dishonorable move by someone who couldn't handle his own success. The psychological toll of being trapped in this environment, knowing he's looked down upon by both the system and his peers, is almost impossible to imagine. Li Rye went from being celebrated and wealthy, surrounded by people, catering to his every whim, to being broke, despised, and living in constant fear for his life. The mental health toll of such a drastic fall is staggering. Without proper support or professional treatment, many people in his position simply don't survive, whether physically or mentally. The real question now is whether Li Rye can actually endure this experience. Prison changes a person, and rarely for the better. The persistent threat of violence, being cut off from everything familiar, the realization that you may never be free again, and the daily humiliations of life inside can break the strongest of individuals. Many celebrities who serve time come out as completely different people, if they even make it out at all. Ultimately, Li Rye's situation is more than just one man's fall from grace. It's a sobering reminder of how quickly everything can vanish. It's about the cycle of poverty, violence, and poor decision-making that traps so many young men from disadvantaged backgrounds. It shows how sudden wealth without the right guidance, financial education, or support systems can be just as destructive as poverty itself. It's a harsh lesson in how the streets that raise you can ultimately destroy you, even when you think you've finally made it out. The real tragedy of Li Rye's story is that it was entirely preventable. With the right mentors, financial literacy, addiction treatment, and support to handle the trauma of sudden fame, he could have built a lasting legacy and escaped the cycle of violence that claimed so many of his peers. Instead, he's now facing the reality of spending the rest of his life behind bars, becoming yet another cautionary tale for young artists walking that same path. His journey serves as a sobering reminder. Success without wisdom is only temporary. Money without financial literacy is dangerous, and fame without character is ultimately meaningless. At the end of the day, the streets don't care about your bank account, your record deal, or your status. The streets will take everything from you if you let them, and sometimes they'll take it even if you try to fight back. The music industry, for all its glamour and opportunity, can be just as treacherous as the block for young people who aren't prepared for the pressure. The sudden influx of cash, easy access to drugs, the constant demand to maintain a tough image, and a lack of real support can destroy a talented artist just as effectively as poverty ever could. Li Rye's current situation in prison also highlights a tragic flaw in the justice system: how differently people are treated based on their resources. If he still had the money for a top-tier legal team, he might have negotiated a plea deal or seen some charges dropped. If he still had influence, he might have been granted protective custody the moment he walked through the doors. But without money or power, he's just another face in an overcrowded system that rarely prioritizes safety or rehabilitation. So, what are your thoughts on Li Rye's situation and his future? Do you think he deserves a second chance to get his life right? Or are these consequences just the reality of the choices he made? How can the music industry better support young artists coming from disadvantaged backgrounds? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And make sure to subscribe for more content breaking down the real stories behind the headlines. The streets are always watching, and we're here to tell those stories. The good, the bad, and the ugly. Real talk. Li Rye's story is far from over, but right now, it looks like a tragedy that could have been avoided with better choices, stronger support, and a real understanding of the responsibilities that come with success. Let that sink in for a minute, and remember, every choice has consequences. and some of those consequences last a lifetime.